And now for our second plenary speaker, Charlie Arnot. Charlie, do come up, Charlie. Charlie is recognized as a thought leader in food and agriculture. He's highly regarded both as a writer and a speaker who engages audiences across the globe. Charlie has more than 25 years experience working in communications, public relations and issues management within the food system. He's the founder and president of CMA, which is an employee-owned consulting firm, works out of Missouri in Iowa and Ohio. He also serves, from our perspective, as CEO of the US Center for Food Integrity, which is a national non-profit organization dedicated to building consumer trust and confidence in today's food system overall. Today, Charlie is going to share his insights on a topic which is arguably emerging as a major risk to many sectors of our aquaculture industry. That's community acceptance of aquaculture practices and our product. The title of his presentation, Ethics, Values and Science, Building Trust in Today's Aquaculture. And for those who are interested, there is a major session which starts immediately after this break this morning, which runs for the remainder of the day. That's in room 11, I believe, if I'm correct. And Kate Brooks as the session chair. Please welcome Charlie Arnot, and I should have marked that.
We just go down to the menu there. Can you pull it up? Hang on one second. Thank you. It's a great pleasure for me to be here this morning. Very much. I've always admired Australia. I've had a chance to be here several times and certainly appreciate the commitment to transparency, to openness, to the very warm reception, and to the gracious hospitality that I've always enjoyed. So I appreciate that very much and look forward to the conversation today and later today during the breakout session with Kate. And I hope that those of you who are interested will have an opportunity to spend some time with us there as well. We also have an Australian Center for Food Integrity. We're continuing to take the models that we have developed in terms of what it takes to build trust in today's food system and agriculture and beginning to move those in other areas around the world with affiliates in Australia and Canada so the model continues to grow. Title of the presentation, as you can see, Ethics, Values, and Science. So it's a unique intersection of those three as we continue to think about what it takes to build trust today. Historically, we have operated in agriculture under the assumption that if we have the right facts, if we have the right data, if science is on our side, ultimately that will prevail. And what we've discovered, to our own frustration, is that is no longer sufficient in today's increasingly complex environment. But we know, and you know, or you wouldn't be here, of the fabulous opportunity that exists for global aquaculture. Fish currently account for 16% of all animal protein consumed on the planet. Demand continues to grow. As Jose was mentioning, in those countries that are experiencing additional growth in their middle class that will have the opportunity to purchase additional high-quality protein. By 2030, almost 2/3 of the fish that people consume will be produced by aquaculture. That's a fabulous testament to the work that has been done and the work that is going to be done as aquaculture continues to improve in productivity and efficiency, all the while becoming more socially responsible. And the value of fish trade in the developing countries is $25 billion, making it the most valuable export, 2 times the value of coffee. So not only is it a fabulous opportunity for the rest of the world, but it is such a phenomenal fuel for developing countries as they continue to look for economic opportunities to grow and enjoy the economic success the rest of the world enjoys. We've also heard already today, and you'll hear again later, as you all are aware, the growing challenges just in terms of capture fishing. 30% of the world's fisheries are described as recovering or exploited or depleted. 57% are fully exploited already. Overall fishing capacity is currently 2.5 times sustainability levels. So even more than twice the overall resource consumption in the World Wildlife Study. If you look at it just in terms of capture fisheries, it's 2.5 times sustainable levels. The cumulative loss due to fisheries mismanagement estimated to be about $2.2 trillion over the last 3 decades, and pollution and other human impacts continue to threaten and stress critical marine habitats. So clearly the opportunity and the need for responsible aquaculture has never been greater. And as Time magazine asked the question, can farming save the future of the last wild food? Is this really the opportunity for aquaculture to replace capture fishing to become the dominant source? Over the last 3 decades, capture fisheries production increased from 63 million to 93 million tons. During that same period of time, look at the phenomenal growth rate for aquaculture, from 5 million to 63 million tons, and by 2030, aquaculture is projected to surpass capture fisheries in total production. In 15 short years, aquaculture will cross that tipping point and surpass capture fisheries if you can build and maintain your social license. That's going to be the critical determining factor. It's not likely to be economics, it's not likely to be science, it's not likely to be technology. It's likely to be if you can earn and maintain the social license that will allow you to continue to grow at the rate you're growing today. So let's spend a little time talking about what it takes to maintain social license and that freedom to operate. Those of you who are involved in commercial aquaculture production are really interested in protecting that freedom to operate, maintaining your ability to do what you do best with a minimum amount of outside interference. And in today's environment, that really requires us to earn and maintain a social license, which we've defined at the Center for Food Integrity as the privilege of operating with minimal formalized restrictions based on maintaining public trust. If the public trusts you to do what's right, they don't feel the need to impose more formal restrictions. Historically, through legislation or regulation, as the senator well knows, when people say, we're uncomfortable with this particular practice, we're uncomfortable with the technology, someone should pass a law, someone should provide more oversight. But today, what we're also seeing is those formalized restrictions not just coming from legislation or regulation, but coming from global food companies who are under increasing pressure to demonstrate their responsible sourcing practices. So brands are now at times replacing that formal structure that we've seen for imposing social control. So it's a very dynamic environment in which we find ourselves operating today. And I'd like to spend a few moments comparing and contrasting the difference between social license and social control, because I think I can make a fairly compelling economic case for maintaining social license. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, as a business, it's very difficult to justify that additional investment if there is not some return. But this is not altruism, it's enlightened self-interest. Because when you operate with a social license, it's generally a system that is flexible, more responsive, and lower cost. As you see market signals, as you see things change, and you have a social license, you have the ability to react and respond much more quickly than in a system where you have extensive social control in terms of regulation and legislation. But you are only granted that social license if you operate in a way consistent with fairly broad social expectations. Can you demonstrate that you're operating in a way consistent with the ethics, values, and expectations of your stakeholders? And have you put in place some kind of self-regulatory mechanism or certification program, the kinds of programs that Jose was referring to demonstrate that you are in fact meeting those expectations? Because once you cross that tipping point, once you cross over to social control, you never go back. It's very, very difficult to go back. You can mitigate the impact of social control, but you never fully recover that social license. And when you operate with social control, it's a system that is always more rigid, more bureaucratic, and higher cost. It's all about regulation, legislation, litigation, and compliance. All elements that add cost to who you are and what you do, make it more challenging and less opportunistic in terms of capturing the global opportunity for aquaculture. And we see those challenges to social license coming in many different forms. Some people simply don't like the idea that fish are now going to be raised on farms. They're supposed to be wild. There's something about aquaculture that's unnatural, and it shouldn't be allowed. Of course, the application of technology, whether it's genetically modified salmon or it's antibiotics or it's other animal health products, a lot of concern about the application of technology in terms of what it means to your social license and the imposition of social control in aquaculture. And the one that I think is perhaps the most threatening and challenging is fraud. If the level of fraud within the seafood industry became more broadly known publicly, I think the global demand for social control would be overwhelming. And I think it becomes really one of those risks that is simply unacceptable in terms of global aquaculture today. And the need to be able to demonstrate that you have a better system for source verification and managing and reducing fraud to assure food safety, I think is one of those critical elements that the industry finds is an immediate and pressing threat that has to be addressed sooner rather than later if you want to be able to maintain that social license. So we know that social license then is based on maintaining public trust. So the critical question for us became, what drives trust? What is it that causes trust? So we began some experimentation to look into that question. We did a meta-analysis of 21 different pieces of research looking at the question of trust in food. And in each of those, we identified the 3 drivers that you see on the left-hand side of the screen. At the very bottom is influential others. That's 2 groups. It's your family and friends, those in your immediate social circle, and credentialed individuals whose opinions you respect. Could be a dietitian, could be a doctor, could be a veterinarian, someone who has a credential that helps you understand that person has a level of expertise that I should now trust. The second element in building trust is competency. Now, historically, that's where we've spent most of our time talking about who we are and what we do. Competency is our technical capacity in science. And we've operated under the assumption that the social decision-making process is logical and rational. And if we simply give people the right information, they'll come to our side of the argument. And if they've not come to our side of the argument, it must mean we've not yet given them the right information, so we'll go get some more science. And if they still haven't come to our side of the argument, we'll go get some more science. And we repeat that cycle over and over and over again, believing that it's competency that drives trust. The third element that drives trust is confidence, and that's the perception of shared values and ethics. Do you and I want the same outcome, and can I count on you to do what's right? So once we knew that those were the 3 real drivers for building trust, we then surveyed 6,000 consumers in the US over the course of 3 years, asking them questions about on-farm sustainability, food safety, animal well-being, worker treatment, a whole range of issues related to food and agriculture. And what we discovered was that confidence, or the perception of shared values, is 3 to 5 times more important than demonstrating competency in building trust. So we've had the historical communication equation exactly backward, because we've always started with our competency, with our data. If we can simply educate the public, they'll come to our side of the argument. What we've now come to understand is that's not the way the process works. That's not the way the model works at all. If people don't believe that you share their values, none of the data that you have to share with them is going to be received. None of it is going to be viewed as valid, and none of it is going to be helpful in terms of bringing them to your side of the argument. That model, by the way, has been peer-reviewed and published, so now we have a published model on what it takes to build trust in food. I want to shift gears just a bit and talk for a few moments about how sometimes we unintentionally undermine the credibility in who we are and what we do simply by the language that we use and the way we begin to position the issues around aquaculture. Lawrence Kohlberg was a brilliant social psychologist. Looking at his picture, you probably thought he was a fashion model. He was not. Brilliant social psychologist at the University of Chicago in the 1960s who spent his entire career studying ethical decision-making. When people are faced with an ethical or a moral dilemma, what's the context in which they consider that question? And by providing his test, the Heinz Dilemma, to thousands of people all around the world, he developed his hierarchy, which has 3 levels and 6 stages. I'm going to walk through those and again talk about how sometimes we mistakenly place our messages in the wrong areas as we think about what it's going to take to build public trust in who we are and what we do. So first, the pre-conventional level, direct impact on me. Stage 1, punishment and obedience. I'm going to clean my room because if I don't, Mom's going to be mad at me. Second, personal rewards orientation. What's in it for me? I'm going to make all of my decisions based on what's in it for me. Then you move to the conventional societal expectations, the good boy, nice girl orientation. What will people think about me or say about me based on what I do? The law and order orientation, I'll be in compliance, so compliance should be sufficient. And then movement to post-conventional, principle-driven social contract, what's in the best interest of the group. And then finally, a commitment to universal ethical principles, things like compassion, responsibility, respect, fairness, and truth. Now, anyone ever heard anybody in aquaculture say, well, of course we take care of the water and fish because that maximizes productivity and the return on our investment? Perhaps. Now, the implied message there is if something else maximizes the return on our investment, we'll do that. because the driver for our behavior is maximizing productivity and return on our investment. So we're not doing it because it's the right thing to do, we're doing it solely because that's when we make the most money. Or do we say, look, we're in compliance with all environmental food safety laws and regulations, leave us alone? Well, that's great, compliance is terrific, but being in compliance with the law is kind of a basic social expectation. So it's not likely to get accolades from society. People kind of expect you to be in compliance with the law. So that's not something that's likely to generate a lot of additional trust and support. Or are you willing to say, as someone involved in aquaculture, I recognize that I have an ethical obligation to people and the planet to produce fish responsibly and to keep food safe. Here's the beautiful part about Kohlberg's model. If you're already doing the right things for the right reason, it costs you nothing to move from the very bottom to the very top. But if you own the ethical high ground, then claim it and talk about it. And talk about your ethical commitment to do what's right, because it is your ethical obligation and it's a responsibility you accept and embrace. And that you're not simply doing it because it maximizes productivity. Now, there's nothing wrong with maximizing productivity. And it's perfectly acceptable to talk about, in addition to doing these things because they are my obligation, they actually also help maximize productivity, which protects the environment and allows us to produce more using less. But if you want to connect based on shared values, you have to connect based on that sense of a shared ethical obligation, not just on science and not on economics. The other challenge we have is that NGOs, non-governmental organizations, advocates, however you choose to define them, the perception is they are committed to a greater good. They're committed to something other than self-interest. So they come to the public conversation around these issues with significant inherent credibility. Business, on the other hand, does in fact have a self-interest motivation. So it begins this conversation with a credibility deficit. You're heading into the third period 25 points down, just when you start the conversation. So the obligation is even greater for those who have a commercial interest to demonstrate that yes, we do have a commercial interest, but we also recognize and accept and embrace that ethical obligation we have to do what's right. So when we talk about a sustainable balance at the Center for Food Integrity, we use a triangle as the illustration for that because of its great structural integrity. And since values are the foundation for building trust, values then are also the foundation for this triangle. Can we meaningfully demonstrate that we embrace the values of compassion, responsibility, respect, fairness, and truth? The kinds of values we know will help us fundamentally build trust. And we don't abandon science, we have to have that objective, measurable, repeatable data to prove the claims we're making. But it needs to play a different role in our public conversation if we're going to be successful. And at the end of the day, if economics aren't working, if you're not economically viable or profitable, you're not truly sustainable. But here is crucially again where we get that public conversation confused. Most of the questions today tend to come at the base of the triangle. Should you house those animals the way you're housing them? Should you keep fish on farms? Should you be using those animal health products or those other genetics? And our typical response has been, well, science says we can. Can and should aren't the same question. Can is a question about competency, should is a question about values and ethics. Science will tell us if we can, but society will tell us whether or not we should. If science alone prevailed, there would be no more conversations about whether or not climate change is real. We'd have significantly more nuclear power, and. The list goes on. If science alone were the determining factor for what society would embrace, but it's not. It's more complex than that. Because when we give people information about economics or science, we increase their knowledge, but we may do very little to influence how they feel or what they believe. And people are much more likely to act on how they feel or what they believe than on simply what they know. That's why engaging in this conversation is likely to be a more successful strategy than educating. Very few people want to be educated. Many people want to be engaged. So it's an opportunity to find that place for your stakeholders to participate in the process in a way that is meaningful for them. And it's crucially important in today's radically transparent environment. When anybody who has a cell phone is a cinematographer, we have to assume that someone is watching everything we do all the time. That's the environment in which we operate today, which in some ways can be fairly liberating. If that's the assumption you make, then to operate in that radically transparent manner can give you a certain sense of freedom. But when you've got this hyper-connected environment where brands and producers and NGOs are all connected, and you add the pressure and immediacy of social media, this volatile or this dynamic environment, this transparent environment can now become very volatile and very dynamic as well. And so learning how to manage that in a transparent manner is going to be crucially important to your ability to maintain that social license and protect your freedom to operate going forward. We also know that the historical models that we've used in communication don't work in this environment. We've always kind of wanted to say, okay, here's the expert. We've got Dr. So-and-so from Hometown University. He's done extensive research. Here's the science. We'll give you the science, and the science alone should be persuasive in bringing you to our side of the argument. But in today's hyper-fragmented communication environment, where communication is much more insular and much more tribal, it doesn't work that way. I would be willing to bet $1,000 that if I were to take a look at the smartphones of everybody in this room, the sources of information that you choose, the places that you go to for information, the way you connect online, no two of us would be identical because of the phenomenal volume of information we are asked to process every day. We all sort and sift that in a way that works for us. That's fabulous, except that it makes us more insular and it makes us more tribal. And because each of us have a confirmation bias, we tend to look for the information that reinforces our existing worldview, which makes it even that much more challenging to have a broad-based social conversation around challenging issues. So the old models of communication become much less effective in the environment in which we find ourselves today. So where do we go from here? How do we begin to think about moving to that next level? Last year we did a series of focus groups, US-based only. But we did focus groups in cities around the US. We said, what's it going to take for you to not hate big food? What's it going to take for you to not hate big agriculture? And they said, you've got to be more transparent. We don't trust you. We don't like your size and scale. We don't like your use of technology. We like your people. We like farmers, but we're not sure we like farming. And so you need to be much more transparent about that if you want us to be more trusting about who you are and what we do. So we said, okay, what does that mean? What does transparency mean? And we decided to spend last year researching that, looking at some secondary research initially to identify some specific elements and then diving into those to come up with some information that can be helpful and constructive in providing actual direction on where you can go and what you can do to make a difference. Because it is about overcoming that bias against size. We know that shared values are the foundation for trust, and yet people hate big agriculture and hate big food. And there is truly an inverse relationship between the size of an entity and the perception of shared values. So as aquaculture continues to get larger, becomes more integrated, becomes more technologically advanced, it's going to be perceived as less value-centric and less consistent with the values of consumers who need the benefits of aquaculture but are going to be more skeptical about your processes. That's the conundrum. That's the challenge in which we find ourselves. And we see that bias against size reflected in our research. When we ask consumers their level of agreement with a variety of statements, here on this one you can see that 28% US consumers strongly agree that small farms are likely to put their interest ahead of my interest, while 48% strongly agree that large farms are likely to put their interest ahead of my interest. On food companies, 31% strongly agree that small food companies are going to put their interest ahead of my interest, while 53% strongly agree that large food companies are going to put their interest ahead of my interest. So the larger you are as an entity, the more difficult it becomes to connect based on values because people believe you're more likely to put profit ahead of public interest. That becomes the bias that drives their concern. Let me be clear, in all of our research, consumers understand and want business to be profitable. They don't mind if business makes money. They want business to make money. What they are concerned about is that you will take shortcuts. That you will take shortcuts to food safety, you'll take shortcuts to animal care, you'll take shortcuts on the environment to put profit ahead of public interest. And that becomes the basis of their bias and the overall bias that you have to find ways to overcome by engaging using your shared values. So these are the 7 different elements of trust-building transparency that we identified in our secondary research: motivation, disclosure, stakeholder participation, relevance, clarity, accuracy, and credibility. We then measured 33 different attributes of those. Half or more of all the respondents gave top box support across all of those. But here's what's most important. The two groups who tend to be most skeptical about today's food system are women and early adopters. Those consumers who are better educated, have higher incomes, and tend to have broader social networks. For both of those groups, they rated trust-building transparency higher than either men or later adopters. So this gives us a roadmap to build trust with those among us who are most skeptical about who we are and what we do today. So these are some actionable items that you can begin to implement. So when it comes to trust-building accuracy, share information that is truthful, objective, reliable, and complete. There's a difference between being honest and being forthcoming. People want you to be forthcoming, not just honest. Trust-building motivation. Consistently show you understand and appreciate the issues important to your stakeholders and take action that demonstrates you put public interest ahead of self-interest. Acknowledge that that's an issue and demonstrate how you put public interest ahead of self-interest. Disclosure. Share information that's important to your stakeholders. Make it easy to find, helpful in making informed decisions, easy to understand, and timely. If it's important to your stakeholders, make it available even if it might be damaging to the company. Stakeholder participation. Ask stakeholders for input. Make it easy to provide, acknowledge it's been received, and explain how and why you make decisions. Your stakeholders understand you are not always going to agree with them, and that's okay, but they want voice in the process. Ask them. Provide an easy mechanism for them to provide feedback. Acknowledge it's been received and explain how and why you've made decisions. That will go a long way toward transparency and trust, even if you don't make a decision they agree with. Trust-building relevance. Ask stakeholders what information is meaningful. Demonstrate you understand and provide information that they deem is relevant. If it's not meaningful to them, it's not meaningful. I frequently assume that I have an idea of what's going to be most meaningful to my wife. I'm generally better off if I ask. So the same rule generally applies to other stakeholders. Trust-building clarity, provide information that is easy for stakeholders to understand. Take technical information and translate it, okay? It's not dumbing it down, it's making it accessible. So when you're a scientific person, make sure that you take that information and make it highly relatable. Trust-building credibility, admit mistakes and apologize, accept responsibility, engage critics and share plans for corrective action, demonstrate you genuinely care and present more than one side of controversial issues. Wouldn't it be nice if we lived in a world where just presenting the facts would be sufficient? That's not where we live today. No, not any longer. The social decision-making process is complex and multidimensional. Just providing the facts, just providing the data is not going to be sufficient to protect your interest. Decisions are not made on facts and rational thought alone. Mistrust of institutions has become the social norm. There's a growing trend of questioning the motives and data of experts, and that tribal communication that we talked about and relational expertise, the loudest voice among my Facebook friends, influences trusted sources and messages. So what are the implications for you? What does this mean for you as a leader in global aquaculture? First, understand and embrace that who you are is as important as what you know. Help people understand your commitment to do what's right, not just your technical expertise. They want to know that you genuinely care about what's important to them. Sharing your values makes your technical information more relevant and accessible. Embrace skepticism. It's not personal. No one is attacking you individually when they ask serious questions about who you are and what you do. We live now in a world that is highly skeptical. Embrace that as the opportunity to engage in that conversation and that dialogue. And remember, skepticism is the fuel for scientific discovery. And the public wants information from academics, but not academic information. Okay? You need to learn to speak the language of social media. Work with someone. We do this a lot with experts across the country. Find ways that you can translate PhD to ADD, because that's the world we live in today, all right? You've got to make it relevant to the audience that is making those kinds of decisions. And embrace the fact that transparency is no longer optional. Oftentimes we assume we're operating in a remote area, nobody's paying attention, nobody cares. That's a pretty risky bet if you're willing to make it in today's environment. It's not safe. So in closing, what are the 3 things that you can do? First of all, begin all of your engagement using your shared values. That's going to be the most powerful tool that you have to connect with audiences and help build trust in who you are and in aquaculture. Former US President Roosevelt said one time, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that's never been more true in highly technical issues like aquaculture. Then you can use independent scientific support to build credibility and accessible language to make your message relevant. Remember, words are the tools that we use to shape perception. You always want to use the right tool, so use the right words. And then finally, commit to engaging early, often, and consistently. This is a generational challenge. There's not going to be a single fix. There's no single public relations campaign that's going to address this. But the potential and need for productive aquaculture is so great that we dare not risk allowing it to fail because we didn't engage in the right way. So engage early, often, and consistently. And make sure you use your values-based communication, because your voice, your knowledge, your credibility matter. You can make a difference in building public support, but you have to learn to play by those new rules. Thank you again. I very much appreciate the opportunity and wish you the best of luck. Hope you can join us in our session later today. Thanks again.